What do you think makes a good journalist? This is my sort of opening question for this video. In my opinion, there's perhaps three things that stand out more than anything else. And this is bearing in mind that journalism itself is a very, very broad field. I mean, the word journalist can really refer to anyone that delivers news content in some way or another. And this doesn't necessarily have to be current affairs. So it could be anyone from a sports writer in a local magazine to a frontline journalist on the streets of Aleppo. That's how broad journalism is. Okay, so what makes the best journalist? In my opinion, courage, research, truth. Those three things, perhaps above anything else. Courage, this goes without saying, the job is dangerous, can be dangerous. And even outside the realm of physical danger, journalists risk arrest, they risk harassment, they risk personal attack, perhaps not physical, but sometimes very personal attacks on their character, on their reputation. Um, so they need thick skin. That goes without question. In fact, ironically, journalists kind of need that in the same way that politicians need that. Politicians are robustly attacked. Um, in Western countries, mostly not physically, but that's not completely inconceivable. It has happened. Um, So definitely courage. Research, this goes without saying. Without research, without putting the work in, it's something that's sometimes understated. Journalists work very hard. They have to. Um, because the sort of deadlines they need to meet, um, you may think like looking at a newspaper, oh, it's a 500-word report, anyone can do that. But when you're meeting a deadline, when you have to secure interviews and so on, it's actually a pretty demanding job. Even, outside, even the sort of freelance journalism where people may be at home, actually the sort of journalism that I'm currently training for. And you may or may not know that I'm currently doing a course on freelance journalism. This is a subject that greatly interests me. And I took journalism at university, although I never graduated. I took a journalism course at the University of Wolverhampton. It's no state secret. That's just the fact. I didn't graduate because of some personal mental health problems, but that's perhaps for another video. So, courage, research, and truth. It goes without saying. You need to tell the truth. Otherwise, you end up simply being either a propagandist or someone who's lacking integrity. You are embellishing a report just to get your name out there, or you are, potentially hurting people. You could be hurting an innocent person by smearing them. You could be, bad journalism can even lead to violence. It can lead to riots. This has happened in this country. So there's a world of difference between good journalism and bad journalism. And to me, that isn't even about the left-right spectrum. There are good journalists on the left, bad journalists on the left, good journalists on the right, bad journalists on the right. I certainly have my preferences in the national titles. One thing that's interesting actually about the print press in this country, I was looking the other day at the world's best circulated newspapers. At the very top is a Japanese newspaper. I forget the precise name now, but it's very, very widely circulated. There's some Indian papers are there, some American ones. I think USA Today is number five. Some of the Indian titles are very widely circulated. I thought, okay, the Sun's going to be in there somewhere. It wasn't. It wasn't even in the top 10. 10 years ago, it would have been. So the print circulation in this country has actually greatly declined. That's just an interesting footnote. I knew it had declined. I didn't realize it declined quite that much. The latest figures, for example, for the Sun show that its annual circulation in, I believe it was 2018, 2019, was 1.5 million. Now, this is way down from the late 1980s when it was at 3.8 million. Now, granted, the readership is still going to be a lot higher because there's all the online formats, which do take up a significant amount of readership, and that goes into many millions more. It's still an influential paper, as is the Daily Mail, its big rival. But, well, actually, these days the Daily Mirror could also be the sort of left wing rival of the Sun. But if you look at the trend, every national title has declined in part because of the change in the industry. Anyway, not for a whole thesis on that, interesting as I personally find it. What I want to talk about really is respect for journalists, frontline journalists specifically. I have not shied away from critiquing particular newspapers and media outlets. There are certain practices that I really have no respect for. For example, the doorstepping technique. I don't like it. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it damages the image of journalism. That is, when you have a scrum of reporters gathering outside, usually a politician's, sometimes a business person's house, their own house, badgering them for questions. I don't like it. I think it is paparazzi-esque. I think just looks very unprofessional. I do not like it. Um, and may God strike me down if I ever do that. Um, then there is, obviously there is certain yellow journalism, sleazy, tabloid, sensationalistic nonsense. In theory, every journalist in the United Kingdom has to abide by a strict code of conduct. So, for example, they can't tell outright lies, they'll be fired from the job if they do. However, there is more flexibility in the print press with the style of reporting, and sometimes what the likes of The Sun will pass off as professional journalism is, in my humble opinion, garbage. I mean, I'm not going to mince my words about that. I think it is. So, for example, they'll be careful to say things like alleged, but then they'll go on to basically call subject names. So it's a style of journalism I've no respect for. Having said that, I do see a place in the market for the tabloid style of journalism. Incidentally, today I read that the Sun had losses of 91 million last year. So it may be that even the tabloid industry may be forced to change in the coming years. It didn't change sufficiently after the phone hacking scandal, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, so there's in-house style of different newspapers. But one thing I have a general respect for, and this is regardless of whether the reporter is from the Sun or the Times or a local publication, and that is frontline journalists, those people who often have to go into difficult situations. Um, this isn't necessarily just dodging the bullets in war zones, although that can be part of that frontline definition. It's also about being in uncomfortable positions where they need to secure interviews, where they need to, get the information they need in order to present a full picture. And in countries like Iran, China, which are not exactly friendly to the West, I'm talking at government level, it can be profoundly difficult to do that because they could very easily find themselves in a position where they're being accused of being a Western spy. Even if they have their press pass, even if they have all the criteria, the geopolitical atmosphere is something that can be beyond their control. So when I talk about dangers in the job, it isn't necessarily threats of death. It isn't necessarily imminent death, but it could be the danger of being arrested. It could be the danger of being harassed. I've seen BBC journalists trying to do their job in China being pushed around by guys in dark clothes, ominous looking guys who are most likely thugs employed by their communist regime. I remember this when there was a sinking on the Yellow River, the Eastern Star, I believe it was called, big disaster on the Yangtze. And BBC journalists were trying to interview survivors, and they were pushed away by the authorities. So that's the sort of atmosphere that journalists sometimes face. So when I hear people attacking Western media, for example, oh, you're just making our country look bad. What I would say to those people is don't attack the messenger, don't attack journalists who are trying to do their job. Point fingers at the regime that is stopping them from doing their job. So, to any Chinese or Iranian viewers who think, oh, it's all biased Western media, let me ask you this. Number one, do you expect journalists to only show the good side? Number two, if you want them to be balanced and show the more positive aspects as well, then don't you think they should have the freedom to do that rather than being harassed by the authorities and constantly have barriers put in their way? Because it is something that I've noticed people often, as soon as someone resorts to blaming Western media, I have to be honest, I think it's just a kind of excuse to deflect criticism from their own government, or rather, maybe because it's not safe for them to criticize their own government, so they resort to attacking the messenger. I think that's wrong because, for the most part, journalists will try to show a balanced picture. For the most part, I'm not saying there isn't corruption in the industry. I'm not saying there aren't journalists who don't have a vested interest. Which brings me to a point about, like I said, I'm training for freelance journalism. What that basically means is I would not be tied to any one publication. I'd be technically working for myself. I'd be trying to get commissions from national editors or regional editors, obviously starting off. I'd be working for myself. I'd still have the fundamental expectations that any journalist would have: tell the truth, um, and work hard. But one thing I do sometimes notice is so-called freelance journalists who are nothing of the sort. So they will say that they're freelance journalists, and when you actually look at it, all they're trying to do is push a particular agenda. Some of these people are very well known, and I'll name one: John Pilger. Now, before people jump down my throat, John Pilger is a very experienced journalist. I'm just a rookie kid compared to what John Pilger is. I get that. But it is very obvious that in recent years he has basically allowed his political ideology, which is very much to the left, to cloud his work. And in my opinion, he has become a yes man for the Russian government. When you get so-called freelance journalists who end up, in their determination to report in a negative light about Western governments, that they end up basically serving as propagandists for example, the Russian government, that is not brave. That is not integrity. That is simply being used. And the same applies, of course, if someone ends up just being used, as a propagandist for, say, the American Republican Party or the British Conservative Party. I would suggest that the dynamic is different because in Russia, state media is very, very closely linked to the Putin regime in a way that you cannot say the BBC is linked to Boris Johnson. It just isn't comparable. Another example, less known than John Pilger, is Eva Bartlett, Canadian national. Her cheerleaders hold her up to be a voice of reason. Oh, look at this brave journalist exposing the Western warmongers. Problem is, she is nothing but an Assad propagandist. This is a woman who is on record as praising the Assad regime. Now, it is simply a lie. She is breaking a cardinal rule of journalism by saying that she's a freelance journalist with no vested interest, because by backing the Assad regime, she is not being honest. She is serving as a propagandist for one side over the other. It would be different if she was saying, this is the Assad regime's point of view versus this is the rebels' point of view. But she is actually, if you actually look at her work, it's, of course, all the conspiracy theorists love it, all the anti-West populists love it, all those who think the evil West is this, that, and the other, but Assad's just an embattled president fighting terrorists. She taps straight into that propaganda. That's why I get quite angry when people like her are held up to be symbols of freelance journalism. In my opinion, they give freelance journalism a bad name because they're not serving as truly independent journalists. They're serving as yes people for a particular regime. She would truly be freelance if she was questioning the Assad regime, but she doesn't. So if you're an Assad regime supporter, of course you're going to love her. Of course you're going to hold her up to be a great um, purveyor of truth. What I aspire to be, if I go ahead with this, and I don't know how much of my life I'm going to dedicate to it, if it's going to be something I do just on the side to get money, or if I'm really going to dedicate myself full time. I haven't quite decided that yet. If I do dedicate myself full time and I actually get assignments that are in some tricky spots of the world, I will always aspire to do three things: be brave because it comes with the job, do meticulous research, and tell the truth. That's it. So I'll just close the list. Journalists do face real problems: arrest, harassment, and I think most people don't realize how much work they have to do. Like I say, it's totally legitimate to criticize any network. I've been very critical of certain approaches that I see within the industry. And I think that whilst it's important for journalists to hold politicians to account, I also think they need to remember they're not above criticism either, right? But it is a dangerous job. In a country like Iraq, where journalists have been killed in their hundreds, Mexico, Colombia, increasingly in India and the Indian subcontinent, in Afghanistan, in Turkey, which has just overtaken China, I believe, or Russia, to be the number one country that locks up journalists. It shows the sort of challenge that these people face. For that reason, as a fundamental general outlook, I have a lot of respect for them, including journalists working for papers I don't particularly like. So, I may hate the Sun as a newspaper, but I still respect a Sun reporter that is on the front line because fundamentally they're taking the same risks as their colleagues, their peers from other newspapers. So that's it. I would also say this: whilst I have personally got issues with the likes of RT and CGTN, I do believe there will be decent people within those organizations who probably are between a rock and a hard place. I know, for example, of Chinese journalists that actually do want to be more independent, they do want to be more critical of the government, or at least be able to ask more questions. But for now, they simply can't. So, whilst many of them go along with the propaganda to advance their careers, I think that there are some people in those networks that do have integrity. I mean, I remember in Russia today when the Ukraine war was going on, there were some high-profile RT anchors who quit on air, which was incredibly brave, actually. And I give them a lot of respect for doing that because they said they're no longer going to push the Kremlin's narrative. I'll leave it there. But yeah, respect to frontline journalists.